I'ma flex on my ex, flex on the hoe. You still be in my head, so I'ma let you know. I realize how much I want you when I let you.
Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we're going to be answering the question of what is the difference between 32-bit and 64-bit. So if you've been looking for information on this topic, hopefully by the end of the video, we will have answered all your questions. As always, if you like this sort of technical information, please make sure to hit the like button and subscribe so that you get notified when we release new videos. First of all, let me just say that both 32-bit and 64-bit are basically referring to the number of bits that are used to represent whole numbers in a computer system. The main purpose of these bits is to address or locate a specific memory location. For example, if we take a look at the 32-bit version of Windows here, which is Windows 7, if we open up the Task Manager and then go to the Performance tab and then click on the Memory button, you can see that it says 32-bit. However, nowadays, 64-bit operating systems are a lot more popular. For example, this is Windows 10, the 64-bit version, which you can confirm by clicking on the About button here, which will show you the operating system information, and right here it says Operating System 64-bit. However, do keep in mind that not only is the current version of Windows available as a 64-bit OS, but also previous versions such as Windows 7 can also be installed as a 64-bit OS. For example, if you are currently running the 64-bit version of Windows 10 and you want to downgrade to Windows 7, there is a possibility that you install the 64-bit version of Windows 7 instead of the 32-bit version. That being said, there are advantages and disadvantages of each type, which is why even though 64-bit has been around for quite some time now, there are still cases where 32-bit might be a better option. So what are those advantages and disadvantages? Let's start with the 32-bit operating system. The biggest advantage of having a 32-bit operating system is the fact that there is a much wider range of software available for it, because, well, 32-bit has been around for a lot longer than 64-bit. And it turns out that a lot of software was developed during that time, and therefore they never bothered to develop a 64-bit version of their programs. This means that if you are running a 32-bit operating system, you'll have access to a much wider range of software. However, this doesn't mean that 64-bit users do have access to the software that was only developed for 32-bit. In fact, nowadays, thanks to something called WoW 6.4, it's possible for 64-bit operating systems to run 32-bit programs without any issues. And this is actually how it's done. Let's say you install a 32-bit program on a 64-bit operating system. When you launch the program, instead of launching the actual 32-bit program, what gets launched is the 64-bit version of the program called the compatibility layer, which will then launch the actual 32-bit program, meaning that even though you are running a 64-bit operating system, you can still run 32-bit programs without any issues. And speaking of running 32-bit programs on a 64-bit operating system, did you know that if you're reusing an older 64-bit processor that supports something called PAE, or Physical Address Extension, it's actually possible to use something called 32-bit mode, which basically allows you to run a 32-bit version of Windows on a 64-bit CPU. So let me explain. Basically, if you enable the 32-bit mode on your 64-bit processor, we'll basically stop using its 64-bit architecture and instead use its 32-bit architecture, meaning that technically you will be running a 32-bit CPU on a 64-bit processor, which makes things a little bit confusing. So in the case of this processor, even though it is a 64-bit processor, if you choose to use 32-bit mode, you will basically be limited to a 32-bit experience. So in that case, what are some advantages of running a 32-bit OS over a 64-bit OS? Well, one of them could be that you have easier access to older games which were only released for 32-bit operating systems. Another advantage could be that you're rerunning an older piece of hardware that is not compatible with 64-bit. But now, let us move on to the 64-bit operating system and discuss the advantages and disadvantages of it. Now, unlike 32-bit, the main advantage of using a 64-bit operating system is obviously that it uses more bits, meaning that it has a larger address space, which means that it will be able to support more memory. As an example, a 64-bit operating system will be able to address up to 16 exabytes of RAM, whereas a 32-bit operating system will only be able to address up to 4 gigabytes of RAM. Now, this means that if you're using a 32-bit operating system, you might start experiencing performance degradation when you're using more than 4 gigabytes of RAM. Now, of course, you could work around this by using something called large physical address extension, but it does come with its own limitations. Therefore, if you're reusing a 32-bit operating system and you're retrying to use more than 4 gigabytes of RAM, it's very likely that your system will not perform properly. Now, even though the most obvious advantage of using a 64-bit operating system is the fact that it can support more RAM, it also comes with other advantages. For example, better performance when processing large files, support for more than 256 processors, and also better security because memory protection is handled at the hardware level. Okay, so what are the disadvantages of using a 64-bit operating system? Well, as I mentioned before, the main disadvantage is the fact that there is less software available for it simply because it hasn't been around for as long as 32-bit has. However, like I showed you earlier, this isn't really a problem because you can run 32-bit programs on a 64-bit operating system without any issues. Another disadvantage of 64-bit is the fact that if you are using a 32-bit program, it's likely that it will not run properly on a 64-bit operating system. However, again, this isn't really a big issue because nowadays, it's almost all software is developed for 64-bit, meaning that the chance of you running into a 32-bit only program is pretty slim. Now, another disadvantage of using 64-bit is the fact that if you are running an older processor, it's likely that it doesn't support 64-bit, meaning that you would have to stick to 32-bit. However, nowadays it is pretty much a thing of the past, because most modern-day CPUs do support 64-bit. Now, another disadvantage is the fact that due to the increased complexity of a 64-bit operating system, it's likely that it will use more resources than a 32-bit operating system. However, this shouldn't really be a problem unless you're using an extremely low-spec system. And finally, last but not least, another disadvantage is the fact that if you choose to use 32-bit mode on a 64-bit CPU, you will basically lose out on all the benefits of using a 64-bit CPU. So overall, which one should you use? Well, honestly, if you're like me and you use your computer mostly for office work, watching videos, browsing the internet, and maybe playing some games here and there, then a 64-bit operating system is more than enough. However, if you're redoing something like programming and you need to run certain 32-bit programs that will not work on 64-bit, then maybe 32-bit would be a better choice. But again, this is less common nowadays. Now, if you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe so that you can get notified when we release new videos. Also, if you have any questions, make sure to leave them down below. And lastly, if you would like to support us even further, you can head on over to our support page where you can become a patron. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.